If you want to be more effective in your work and in your life, and you'd like to have more confidence that you're meeting your intentions, this is where it begins. Welcome to Do Busy Right, helping you organize your information and manage your attention so that they work for you, not against you. We educate you and encourage you by discussing ways to be more effective, not more exhaustive. Let's do busy right. Hi there. Today, I'll talk about the tool set for the kind of information and attention management that Attention Compass provides, what I think we're all looking for in terms of attention and information management tooling. When I talk to people, I get a lot of questions about tool use. I use tool X. Is that okay? What about tool Y? Do you have a recommendation for what kind of tool I should use? And most of this revolves around the question, where should I keep my stuff? If you're thinking about a tool, a new one, or changing over, today we'll talk about the best way to do that. Now, when I say tool, I mean online service, system, database, app, Google Keep, Apple Notes, Clickup, Evernote, and thinking, where should my stuff be? This place is the information storage tool, and it's a core part of the Attention Compass system. Our information is a primary consumer of our attention in two ways. The first way is it uses our attention to comprehend it. We have to use our attention to make meaning of the information we receive. And secondly, it consumes our attention finding it when we need it, finding our information when we need to use it again. And the storage tool is primarily about finding it when we need it. It's not so much about comprehending the information, but we do want to record that comprehension. But we want to be very efficient with both components of this. It's vitally important that you have a tool, that you have a place. And we'll talk about how that fits into the grander scheme of things in more detail. We'll talk about the properties of good tools. I want to give you the purpose, properties, and functions of a tool that's going to fit in with the Attention Compass mindset. We're thinking about the outline of a tool that should work, and then perhaps you can go find a tool that fits that structure better. To be perfectly clear about the tool, we're talking about a tool for personal information management. It's a storehouse for information. All of our information needs to go into one place. And it almost definitely needs to be online. And I say that because I can't imagine a paper-based system that would fit in with the way we use the system in Attention Compass. The storehouse is the big thing. It's the named app. Evernote is a storehouse. Google Keep is a storehouse. Within a storehouse, we have something that I refer to as containers. If we want to look at a metaphor, a library is an information storehouse. It holds books that are containers of information. Now, the question pops up, is having a container the ideal way to structure information? I'll say information in the wild is unstructured. You have to give it some structure so you can organize it and find it again. The container then is the structure of the unit of information that the system supports. It defines what our information can do and what we can do with our information. If we look at the library again, we go to the library, we check out a book. There are certain things that we can do with the book. Now, some of them are because of the physical nature of the book itself, but some of them are because of the rules of the library. If you get a magazine from the library, for example, there might be different things that you can do with that, with the magazine. And that's the container idea. It's not a rigorously defined term. You won't find a definition out there. One of the challenges of defining it is that since we're in this medialist world, container is a metaphorical term. And I'll tell you what I mean by metaphorical term. all the information out there, the huge majority of information out there is electronic. In our systems, in our storehouses, we create containers that mimic the kinds of containers that we have in real life, typically. And I hope that clarifies what's going on with these containers. I'll give you another example. If you go to OneNote as a system, the container is an electronic piece of paper. When I first started using OneNote, almost everything in there looked like it was oriented around a piece of paper. It just didn't have a physical reality. You could take a OneNote and print it and actually turn it into a piece of paper. It even had a templates with lines like 3-hole paper, and you used that so that you could write on it in nice even lines. Everything looked like paper. So I walked in understanding something about how to use it. Multiple pieces of paper, multiple pages. These collect up into notebook sections. You could have notebooks within notebooks and all this hierarchical stuff that was very much like a 3-ring binder. And we look at that container and we understand it and how to use it in a lot of ways. But that container determines what we can and can't do with the units of information it contains. And it's designed by a human being to replicate something in the world. Those human beings can modify these containers. An example I'll give you again in OneNote. If you've used OneNote, one of the more astonishingly helpful features if you're handwriting is you can go to the middle of some handwriting and spread it out and create new paper in between the handwriting. If you're using a tablet in your handwriting, it's really useful. And I'd imagine that most things, the remarkable, I think, is the current handwriting thing. Got to edit that. So that's really weird because if you're taking notes on physical paper, you can't just make more space in the middle. That's one of the challenges of using physical paper. You have to have eraser crumbs. Now back to containers. Since the container holds, if you will, supports the properties, it determines what we can do with the information contained. Formerly, the physical media defined what you could do. So physical media was a container for information. And now the metaphorical media only defines it to the degree that it mimics the physical media. OneNote's a good example. You build more space in there, just like you can't do on notebook paper. So that's pretty interesting. Now, I said the app developers create that container. Now they have a challenge because if they create a container that is purely different that nobody recognizes, then users are going to complain that they don't know how to use the system. But if these designers create a container that's similar to something that's previously existed, metaphorically similar, then they have the same limitations as the thing that existed. But regardless of that, that container is how information is stored in computer apps and determines how that information can be used. So we'll be looking at containers and trying to find one that exposes the right properties for use in the attention compass system. There's a question out there, a theoretical question. Is there one right container for information? And at present, that's a little murky for me because we don't know what the fundamental unit of information might be. I understand that computer scientists say that the fundamental unit of information is a bit. I understand the argument and just disagree with it. If it's a bit, then a bit is too small to be useful to human brains. So I think there's another fundamental unit. On the other hand, we can't just take information at large. We've got to be able to chunk it somehow. Otherwise, it's just this stream of consciousness blah that happens to us. We don't know how to chunk it. So we have to do something with it, and that's these containers. And we've always done this. Notes, piece of paper with a note. I've got a receipt here from a purchase I made. So that's one sheet, one page, and it's a container for information that's structured in certain ways. And because of that, I call it a receipt versus calling it a bill, for example, or calling it a page from a book. It looks a certain way, has certain information. So I called it a receipt, and that indicates a kind of container for information. If I tell you it's a receipt, then you can guess pretty well what kind of information is on there. You'd be pretty close to right. So we communicate in these ways with container kind of language. Another example of a container, a calendar appointment is a container. I don't care what system you use, your calendar appointment is very similar from GCal to Outlook to whatever system you use to a paper calendar. They're all similar. Certain kinds of information goes in there and fits very well. Other kinds of information doesn't fit well at all. Kind of information that fits well is determined by the container. Date, start time, end time, attendees, location. There's usually a space for some notes, although they're pretty unstructured and pretty hard to get to. Other things don't fit so well in there. If you need the phone number of one of the individuals that's going to be at the meeting, you can't find that in the typical calendar appointment. You might find a link to it. An electronic calendar appointment will hold long notes, many words, versus a paper calendar appointment that won't. So that's a difference in how it holds information. The container doesn't hold a map to the location. That doesn't fit well in the container. Bios of people, previous meeting notes, doesn't fit well. Now, I will say different systems have differences in the information they expose, but the similarities are where it's at. So some calendar event may have a, how do you want to show this time on your calendar to everybody else? Busy, free, working elsewhere, that kind of thing in Outlook. But where the similarities are where it's at, they're all calendar events. If they were very dissimilar, we wouldn't call all calendar events. We'd call the dissimilar one something else. Now, that said, container names don't convey a lot of information. Google talks about a calendar, Outlook talks about a calendar, Franklin Covey talks about a calendar, but they're different enough to cause some confusion. For example, a note in Evernote, and that's the term is a note, is very different than a note in OneNote because there's different things that you can do with them. They're both called notes. So you can't really rely on that naming. You got to take a look underneath and see what it actually does. That helps us identify a system that exposes containers that'll be useful for us in managing our attention and tasks in the attention compass process. Now, I've studied personal information management because that's what attention compass is really about. Personal information management is a formal academic study of how we interact with information as individuals. It's not personal in the sense of, well, private information versus business information or public information. It's personal in the sense of individual. It's my information that gets managed as compared to group information management or business information management. So the personal information management people created a list of the kinds of information that a personal information management system should be able to deal with. And this is just an example categorization. So we look at these things that they've identified, these kinds of information, and maybe these should be things that a system, a good system, exposes to us, first-class citizens. And if we understand these four kinds of information, then we can look and compare different personal information management tools and say, if it doesn't support all of them, then it's a weaker system than one that does support all. That kind of comparison becomes available. Now, I will say, I talk to a lot of people that get used to a tool, they get used to a container type, and they just sort of get married to it and they argue. And they say, well, my tool is the best tool because it works for me. Humbly, I submit, have you measured? How does it work for you? In what way? Compared to what else? Does it help you do right things? Or does it help you and support bad information storage habits? And I use all kind of metaphors for this. If we're looking at a flathead screw kind of problem, and you've got a Phillips screwdriver and you figured out how to do it sideways, you get a flathead screw out, you could do it. I show you a flathead screwdriver and go, hey, this is probably better. You say the Phillips works for me. I'm going to say, well, give this a try. It works better. And some people say, no, it'll be fine. I just use my Phillips. I'm comfortable with it. It'll be okay. I don't want to learn to use a new tool. And other folks are like, yeah, give me that flathead. Show me what's going on here. Let me learn about it. So being open-minded to these ideas is probably the best approach. So this is a tool set that allows you to be more open-minded and to make a broader comparison from a pure informational standpoint. I will say containers are important because at the bit level or the transmission level, there's actually very little difference between the bits that are stored in, say, a contact container in Outlook versus the bits that are stored in a calendar container. The computer doesn't care. In other words, the bits are the bits. The computer doesn't care. So we're not trying to solve a technical problem. It's more of a computer interface, a usability problem. But we do need to understand that the interfaces, these containers, determine how we can use the tools. You can massage things a little bit. You could probably store chapter 1 of your forthcoming bestseller in the notes field of a calendar item. You could, but why would you want to? It's not going to enhance the functionality of that information. It's going to make it look like a calendar item. So, can we manipulate things a little bit? Yes, we can. I counsel people to just be careful and not get married to the app they're using because it's comfortable and they've got habits around it. If you're using it out of habit doesn't make the best tool. We need to learn some new habits, but our tools can reinforce our existing habits. You can habitually use a bad tool, but a better tool used habitually makes a difference. It makes you more effective. So, being open-minded to that. So we've talked a lot about the container, and we haven't talked in detail specifically about what it is, but we've defined it. So let's talk about the system itself. So containers have features, properties, whatever term you want to use. So does the system. So if we go back to our library example, a library system is a storehouse and books are containers for information. A library handles books differently than you handle books at home. Okay. You probably don't have the Library of Congress catalog number on a sticker on the spine of your books in your home library. Probably not. There may be a few that you acquired from a library. But I'm just taking a guess. Another example of the difference between how you store books and how the library stores books. You don't have a system to record who has what book, probably. Okay. Libraries, that's their stock in trade. So the system has properties and features. And the distinction is a property of the system really applies to all the different instances of a container. Okay. The way a library handles a circulating book is mostly the same, regardless of the title of the book or the shape of the book, really. So now we can talk about properties of the system versus properties of the container. So there are a few properties that personal information system needs to have. I can think of a few, there's probably more. So let's think about security. In the library metaphor, do the doors lock or do we just allow anybody in at any time? Our question is, how much privacy do we want to have? How well protected does our data need to be? And this is a system level property. It's not a property of this specific container. Security is an issue. For example, do you want to store your personal information online, or do you want it on a local store on your computer? Because those two things have different levels of security. So again, it's important. It's an important property of the system. So think about that. Data availability is a big one. So if we're going to put all of our information in there, the whole point of having our information stored is so we can get to it when we need it. Is there mobile access? Can I get to it from where I am? And again, that's a property of the system, not a property of the container. Now, certainly, and I think we alluded to this, data availability interacts with security. By definition, if you can't access information from everywhere, it's more secure. Where if you have it locked down on, say, your home computer and you can only access it from that terminal, then it's more secure. So these things interact together, but still there's specific categories you want to think about. A third category is information management. And what I mean by information management is, I don't mean the container. I mean more the system level stuff. Does it archive your information? Does it do backups? If your computer was to crash, is there another copy of that information you could get to? If you store it online on their servers, how do they back it up? If you store it locally on your computer, do you have a good backup protocol? What's the restore process look like? So that's the information management level property of the system. Okay, so we're using more precise ideas here, and we're working our way down the stacks. We started with the system. Okay, got those three properties. Now we're going to talk about properties that are interactions between the system and the container, and then we'll talk about properties of the container itself. The system can interact with the container in a lot of ways, but just a couple. One property is the storage metaphor. And that's a property of the system and the container. I want to say storage metaphor, it's how do we put things in there? What is the means of storage? Do we create a new thing and save it, or are edits automatically saved? Is there some place to keep it while I'm not sure exactly what it is, or does it require a full categorization out of the gate? In other words, could you take your book to the library, or does it have to already have a Library of Congress sticker on it? So can you put things in the container that are somewhat less structured and let them grow structure around them? That's a little quirky, and it may raise some questions in your mind. And it goes back to this notion maybe of what kind of container we're looking at. So if you have multiple kinds of containers in your system, then you may not be able to make a clean decision about which kind of container you want to use with a brand new item that you haven't thought a lot about yet. It may take some time to understand what this is in order to store it well. Here's an example. Some sales applications that I run into distinguish between prospects and customers. And the difference normally is, have they bought something? But if the system makes you determine that, then it slows you down when you're storing information. And it might not matter at this stage. So here's the scenario. You're a salesperson and you come across somebody new. Oh, I met them and I got their phone number and they said I can call. But I don't know if they're a current customer of ours or if they're just curious and looking around. I don't know if they've bought stuff before. I don't even know if they know who we really are. But if I have to say, well, before I can enter them, I need to decide if they're a prospect or a customer, then that's going to slow me down. So maybe there's a third category that would be useful here, because if it has to be a prospect or a customer, and I decided it's a customer, then there's probably additional information that I need to enter in order to complete that record. And that really slows me down. So when we think about the storage metaphor, it needs to be really easy. And by that, I mean, it needs to take unstructured information and give you the opportunity to add structure to it as you understand information better and better and better. Because that's how information works in our heads. We hear about something and we have a vague understanding, but then we study it or explore it or research it, and then we understand it better in more detail. So that's the storage mechanism. The other one at this interaction level is the retrieval mechanism. How do we get stuff back out of the system? For example, for a while, global search was a big deal. Some systems had it, some systems didn't. And even now, I think we're just getting to the point where almost every system will search inside of attached documents in this global search, and will search using OCR. So if there's text and pictures, you'll find it. So we want to have search, but what kind of search and what does it need to do? So that's part of the retrieval mechanism. And the retrieval mechanism is important because I don't care how well you store it. If you can't retrieve it, then it's useless. You got to be able to get it back out. Global search definitely has a place, but it's not a panacea. So it's not okay to say, well, it has global search, so that's good enough. Global search is a little tricky because it winds up usually returning too many possibilities when you're doing a search. If you do a global search and it returns 100 pages, then that search really has not helped you all that much. It's going to take you a while to get through those 100 and find the one that you're actually looking for. So I want you to think of global search as the retrieval mechanism of last resort. And we'll see what other retrieval mechanisms there are. So retrieval mechanisms often have to do with the structure of the system. For example, in OneNote, the primary retrieval system is hierarchical storage. It's what notebook does it live in, what section is it in, what page is it on. And maybe that's good enough for what you need. My guess is it's probably not. Another way that this happens other than hierarchical is tags. Many systems now are employing tags. The question is, how do tags work? Do they provide a good retrieval system? Can you search based on a tag, and is that search saved? So you can do them automatically, or do you have to type it in every time? So all of these questions are about the retrieval mechanism. And the retrieval mechanism needs to be more sophisticated than just global search. As I said, global search is the retrieval mechanism of last resort. It's the life raft because we can find something eventually using. So talked about properties of the system. And then there's a few properties at the level of interaction between the storehouse and the containers. So properties of the system: security, data availability, information management in the sense of backup, archive. And at this interaction level, it's the storage metaphor and the retrieval metaphor. How do we store things and how do we get things back out? So now we'll talk about the four kinds of information that the personal information management experts say should be in your system. I'll say they're not perfect categories. It's a classification system, and our classification systems are not great. Now, if you think I'm wrong, go study biology. Okay. We try to discreetly classify things that actually live on a spectrum, and naturally we're bad at it. The best classification system I've ever heard of is Mendeleev's table of the elements. And it's the best classification system because, as far as I know, it's the only classification system that predicted things we hadn't seen yet. If you don't know this story, it's fascinating. Go take a look at it. Given the periodic table of the elements, Mendeleev predicted there would be certain elements that we hadn't found yet. But knowing something about them helped us find them. So it's a really fascinating story, but that's a complete aside. Our classification system here is not nearly that good. But we will talk about four things. And those four things: contact management, calendar management, communication management, and records management. We'll talk about each of these in some detail. Contact information is pretty simple. There are people in your world that you need to know how to get hold of. So contact information is what you think: phone number, email address, physical address. Time zone is sometimes a useful piece of information. Now, I will say there's a wide variety of information that gets stored in things that are called contact records. I've seen several different CRMs. A lot of them store multiple phone numbers, which can be useful. Some of them store family members' names and birthdays, a spouse's name, spouse's birthday, these kinds of ideas, pets' names. I've seen pets' names. So all these different detailed things, and that's really salespeople trying, I guess, to be salespeople. But contact information is information about people that we need to be in touch with. So that's one category of information that the system needs to be able to deal with effectively and may need its own container in the system. We'll talk about that. The second category is calendar information. And this is all about managing our time, and another one that's very familiar to all of us. Now, you know my ideas about managing time versus managing attention. Nevertheless, we do really need a calendar. Here, the container unit is usually something like an appointment in the calendar. And we know what it looks like. It has date, start time. I listed them before. End time, list of attendees. But we need to be able to manage our time in the system to some degree. It's nuanced, and you've heard me talk about this before. But we won't do that now. The third category is communication management. And this one is somewhere in between contact information and records management. For now, let's just say that we need information about communications that we've had with other people. I also need information about ways to communicate them with them. How do I get them on Zoom? But that may fade over into their contact record. Which email address do they tend to respond to? Here's a tricky one. It'd be nice if I knew what I had talked with them about, regardless of the medium of the individual conversations. If I had some summary of our communication over the last, say, 6 months. Now, it doesn't matter to me or probably to them which communication mechanism we used. And by that, I mean, were we text, email, voice, whatever. It doesn't matter, but that fragments the storage of the information. And I'll be real clear about what I mean here. If we communicate on a Zoom meeting and I record our conversation, that's stored over in Zoom somewhere. If our conversation is by email, it's stored over in email somewhere. And these things are very challenging to unify into one view, into one system. So when we talk about communication management, that's what we're talking about here, is some place to store or refer to all the different communications that we've had, period, but specifically perhaps with an individual. And that sort of blurs the line with this fourth category we'll talk about. The fourth category is records management, historical data management. I'll say this is about formal kinds of records management. Like, what do you do with 7 years of tax returns? Like, where's your hard copy Social Security card? Where are copies of policy documents that you have agreed to be responsible to execute on? You know, these are more formal responsibilities that we have. Now, the big deal about communication management is I don't care what the medium is. I want stuff to be in one place, at least to appear to be in one place. I want to see all of our communications together. Now, when we talk about records management, that's not going to be possible, most likely, because some of it's on paper. We know we need to keep some originals. You can't have a picture of your passport on your phone. I mean, you can, but that's not going to get you anywhere with immigration. You got to physically have the passport. So that's a little bit of a challenge. We know that paper systems have their challenges and we prefer electronic systems. So one of the challenges here is how do we refer to paper systems from within electronic systems? Something in the system that handles that regardless of where it lives, and that's why it's similar to communication management. Now, I will say records management is the blurriest of the categories because I sort of dealt with them in that order. But we've talked about all four of them. And one of the nuances, there's a few nuances I want to bring to the party here. One I've already talked about, and that's we don't necessarily know where our information needs to be stored or what kind of container it needs when we first become aware of it. We don't necessarily know that. I've already talked about that. And the second is in Attention Compass specifically, we talk a lot about actionable information versus reference information. In the scheme I just gave you, records management is about historical stuff. Communication management is about what medium did we use, what was the content of our communication. But there's not a clean category in this personal information management schema for actionable information versus historical information. I think because of the actionable information, a great personal information management system has to have something for a task list. Now, they didn't cover that in this grouping, but maybe they thought it was about calendar information. Now, I think some task things fit well into a calendar, but many of them don't. I think that actionable information is a superset. Calendar is a subset of our actionable information. So I think that probably needs to be a fifth kind. Okay, is we need a container for actionable information, and we'll talk about how that works back into the four categories. But a container for actionable information is going to have a lot to do with priority, due date, amount of work required, project management and task kinds of items. And so we want to be careful when we're looking at this and think about whether or not our tool is good. And we can do that by matching up to these categories. So we've talked about how well we've defined these categories, and you can talk with yourself about how well does my tool do each one of those things. And don't forget about the fifth category. So if you remember, the system properties we talked about, and this will be a little bit of a recap, the system properties we talked about were security, data availability, and information management. That's archiving backups. Then we had a couple of things that we talked about at that next level, that interim level, and that was the storage metaphor and the retrieval metaphor. In certain ways, those need to work that you need to look for in a tool. Now, I will say generally hierarchical storage is probably not what you're looking for at that level. So then we talked about the 5 kinds of things that need to be stored. So altogether, that's the 10 things that we want to be thinking about. So it'd be pretty straightforward. And this is how do we use this information I'm giving? Okay. We have a piece of paper with 10 columns, and each one of those is about one of these features that a system needs to have. And then we say, okay, well, system X, on a 1 to 3 scale, how well does it do security? Oh, it's a 2. And then we just sum that up out to the right, and we can pick the best tool with a rational means of doing it. Right? I will say some systems, there's a couple of different ways to look at this spectrum. Some systems try to have multiple kind of containers, and Outlook is an example of this. It has contact containers, it has calendar event containers. And I'm not sure how hard it tries to have communication management because I don't use Teams, but I do use Outlook. I do know Outlook is not terribly strong on records management in terms of other data that might need to be in there. The point is that Outlook has different kinds of containers all built into one system. So that's one approach, but it's challenging because then all the containers are shaped differently. So people usually get into trouble trying to build the Swiss Army. Now, we then have an integration problem. So if you have different kinds of containers, we have an integration problem. How does one type of container speak to or about another type of container? And we'll get into that perhaps later. So at the other end of the spectrum is generalized containers that can store anything. So one example of a generalized container is a bound paper journal. We can store information about calendar events. We can store information about contacts. We can store information about anything we want on this piece of paper with a pencil. It's very flexible, very generic. It doesn't store communication, voice recordings, or video recordings, but you get the idea. But because of the generality, it also doesn't support anything particularly tightly. And that might be okay, but there's another challenging approach here, which is people pick the system that supports the best in class of the kind of container that they're looking at right now. This used to be a little bit more true than it is now as tools kind of aggregate and conglomerate. But people would have a contact database, and it was just for contacts, and it was over here in one system, and they'd have a calendar, and that was over there, and the two were separate, and they didn't interact very much at all, except in the mind of the user. Now, this violates our one system rule, because if we go to look for somebody's email address, well, I had a meeting with them, I also communicated with them, and it might be in my contact record. So how do I find that? And so if we do have multiple systems, then we have it could be in more than one location problem. And that's tremendously challenging when we go to search. So I've not, with multiple different container types, I've not seen a good integration system. That does not mean it doesn't exist. It just means it's apparently not easy. Okay, so there's this spectrum. So way out on one end, we've got 5 specialized tools that handle 5 different kinds of containers. Okay, 5 different systems. The challenge is not just integration, but what happens with those things at the system level. Do they all equally support backup? Do they all back up the same way? Can I back up to one place? Or am I now going to have 5 different backup mechanisms? Do they all equally support security? You know, is there some sort of single sign-on, or do I have to have 5 different passwords? So that's the challenge of that extreme end. The other end of the spectrum, Evernote, for example, is a very abstract kind of tool. It does not make you conform to much at all. The problem here is if I have a new contact and I forget to get their phone number, there's no mechanism in Evernote to tell me that I forgot. Versus if you're using a contact database and you make phone number a required field, then while you're talking and typing, it says red, phone number, phone number, phone number. And so you remember to get it. Okay. And the contact management system probably tells you that. So all of these different tools on the spectrum, I think we're a little bit behind. I think we could develop better tools here. And that's one of the reasons why I'm recording this episode, is so we have better language around the kind of tools that we need. But the extremes, one system per kind of information I need to store, that's this 5 system, one end of the spectrum extreme. The problem with that, how do I look at multiple places? The other extreme is the abstract container like Evernote. And the problem with abstract is how do I get it to help me have complete data? Now, in the middle is this integration thing. And we've already talked about the challenge of integration. Is every container a first-class citizen? Do they all talk to each other? How good is that talking? This is the kind of stuff that I've thought about on your behalf so that we could do Attention Compass and do it well. Attention Compass deals with all of these ideas in one nimble little package. But beyond that, personal information management is not well explored. We're just beginning to do that. Attention Compass is my effort to put you in control of this information so you don't have to worry about it as much. You just know it's in there and you don't worry about it. Attention Compass is not heavily tool oriented. It doesn't have 5 kinds of containers as independent items. It's more on the flexibility side of the spectrum. It focuses more on the workflows, on the habits of good information management, than on the data-oriented technical matters. And that's where it fits in. It does have a tool set that does things. It has, the tool set has an emerging organizational schema. And so that's very helpful as people start to use a new tool. Reach out to me if you're interested in an Attention Compass or understanding how I use Evernote, or if you're an Evernote user and like it, or you're not an Evernote user and you want to explore it, got some questions, we can talk about all that sort of thing. So reach out to me on LinkedIn. If you do connect with me on LinkedIn, just say in the note, just say, hey, podcast. And that way I'll know it's a decent connection versus some of the junk that's out there. The other way is to hit me on email. It's Larry@dobusywrite.com. And don't forget that dobusywrite.com has the archives of the podcast. So when I refer back to these other episodes from time to time, if you want to see them, that's where you can go and find that. So let's recap where we've gotten on this personal information storage tool thing. And we talked about 10 properties, and they're spread across 3 categories. So at the first category, what properties does the storehouse have? And we're thinking about things like security, data availability, data integrity, information management, that level. So those 3 things, they're kind of interwoven. And they're pretty well known at the computer system level. People that write computer systems or software systems tend to talk about things like security and data integrity. So it's not hard to figure that out, but it is important. So then there's these 2 interim properties that relate to the interaction of containers and the system. The first is the storage metaphor, and this is important for us because we're using the system primarily as a storage and retrieval system. In particular, with the storage metaphor, how much do you have to know about the information before you can effectively store it? Does it have to be a precise set of knowledge, or can you store some really imprecise things? And then we look at the retrieval mechanism, and that's with the storage schema. Is it pages and sections and notebooks and books? Is it hierarchical, or is it something different than that? Is it tag based? I will say in particular with the retrieval mechanism, and I've discovered this, and this is important in attention compass, things should be able to look like they're in more than one place at the same time. And I've talked about that in other episodes. So then that's the system level, the interim level, and then at the container level, the kinds of containers that you might think about needing. And we started with 4, but we took away 5. So just to be perfectly clear, the first is contact management. That's managing the people in your lives. Pretty simple. Calendar management, managing your time. Pretty simple. We're all well acquainted with these things. Communication management. What have I discussed with people? And this one is a little murky because it tends to be divided up amongst multiple systems, and it has some overlap with records management. But then we blew records management up altogether and completely changed it. And we went with managing actionable information, and that's kind of task level information, and reference information, which is more like our notes, historical stuff. So that's the 5. And I talked a little bit about how we developed them. So let me run them down again. The 5: contact management, calendar management, communication management, actionable information management, reference information management. And if we explore that, then it puts us in a position where we can handle all these different kinds of things. So look at your tool, look at your storage tool. How well does it do in each one of those 10 categories compared to a different tool that you might be looking into? How well in each of the 10? And that at least gives you a yardstick, a measurement mechanism, so that when you look at tools, you're not just relying on familiarity and habit to decide what the best tool is. If you decide to look into another tool and want to make that investment, you know where to find me. In the meantime, go do busy right. I'll leave it there for now. This is Larry Tribble, Ph.D. Thanks for taking some time to improve your task and information management on the Do Busy Right podcast. The show is dedicated to helping you think about how to get better at working. And we do this by improving your attention and your focus. I believe that your work is not just about your job, but about all the tasks that you do to turn yourself, your environment, and your relationships into what you want them to be. What we're really talking about here is the underpinnings of becoming who you want to be. The primary way I help people is through coaching the attention compass process. Attention compass is 4 workflows and a tool set that support our information, task, and attention management. I help people with big goals to build habits that put them in a position to achieve. We do this by eliminating wasted time and wasted attention. If you'd like to know more, you can find me on LinkedIn or go to dobusywrite.com for more information. Have a good week, more effective and less exhausted. Do busy right.